We had much to be grateful for. I had a lovely wife, the blessings of her family, and I had now gained some valuable experience as a teacher, which would help with job applications back in BC. Fortuitously, that chance visit to Mr. Chakalisa uh, on our previous visit to Botswana bore fruit beyond my wildest expectations. While I was saying farewell to Zimbabwe and making plans to return to Canada, there was a phone call for me at the WUSC office in Harare. Where are you, Mr. Gafford? Why are you not in Francistown? It is extremely inconvenient. You must come at once. Mr. Chaka's words. It was one of those extraordinary life-defining moments when something profoundly important happens for no good reason that one can neither see nor understand, which causes one to listen to the idea of fate or a greater purpose. It felt as though my departure from Africa was being held up, that I needed to understand more. Whatever it was, I grasped it with both hands and said a little thank you. The mad scramble to Francistown turned into more of an adventure than I had wanted, simply because I chose to go by bus. You see more of the towns you pass through on a bus than if you take a train. What I had forgotten on my first trip to Botswana is that when you travel by road, the two border posts are several kilometers apart. There are no buses that take you across the border, as I had assumed, and I was bringing with me the steamer trunk that contained, amongst other things, several weighty books. The bus station at Plumtree is at least a kilometre from the border, and while I was able to get a taxi driver to take us that far, there was still a long line of shoppers trying to smuggle funds out of Zimbabwe, as well as having to negotiate the no man's land between the two posts. The custom agents were in fine fettle when we finally arrived at the front of the line. They were most interested to see my tax clearance form. I was leaving the country, and this was one last chance of uh, last piece of bureaucratic nastiness that they could inflict on anyone choosing to escape. Fortunately, all our papers were in order. I was well practiced as we had already recently come and gone to the UK. There was an air of unnecessary officiousness about it all, but we were finally waved through, largely, I suspect, because Tendai was smiling a lot at our interrogator. We then had to cross the no man's land between the two border posts and enter Botswana for a job for which I had no work permit. It took almost 2 hours in the hot sun to arrive at the other side. I had never felt so close to heat stroke in my life and was greatly relieved to discover a tap on the outside wall of the Botswana Customs House. I put my head under it and must have presented quite a sight when I got up and walked into the cool, well-staffed building to present my case. There was no drama. They called Mr. Chakalisa and then passed the phone to me. He instructed me to put up at the hotel that night and come and see him in the morning. I was given a 3-month visitor's permit and a cheery "Welcome to Botswana!" There was even a bus outside waiting to take both us and the shoppers 96 kilometers to Francistown. When we arrived there, I discovered that Martha's Bay Secondary School was just 100 meters or so from the railway station. Tendai took a long time to forgive me for that one. The next morning at 7 a.m., I was at the assembly being introduced to the school. Mr. Chakalisa then brought me into the office and handed me my schedule of classes. He wanted me to start teaching right away. I hesitated. There were a few hundred questions I had in mind, but he seemed disinterested in hearing any of them. It was a trait I later realized that I associated with short men in Africa. I tell, you listen. He understood my hesitation and added, come and see me at lunchtime and I will tell you where you can stay. I have no houses on campus, so you must stay in town. Now, please, get to your classroom. They are waiting. After hastily scanning my timetable, I asked him to point me in the direction of my classroom. The numbers are on the doors, Mr. Garford. You cannot miss them. Off I went. There was one minor issue that Mr. Chakalisa had chosen to ignore, but one even his iron will could not circumvent in the long run. After moving us into a three-bedroom mansion at the top of the town, extracting a frightening amount of rent and telling us how to connect with the power company, he then informed me that I should get down to Gaborone and present myself to the Ministry of Education. I suppose that my position had already been approved and that it was a mere formality that required me to sign a few documents, pay for the processing of the paperwork, and would be back in the classroom 48 hours later. The trip to Gaborone started early at the train station, and there were a few stops along the way. For the most part, the railway and the main road ran side by side, and for stretches, both were as straight as a die. Drivers seemed to take great pleasure in racing ahead of the train, and if it wasn't, and it wasn't long before I discovered that the country had earned the reputation for having amongst the deadliest roads in the world. Speed is one factor, but there was also the distance between the communities. There were no cell phones, so ambulances would first need to be notified by a passing driver and then dispatched. In Botswana, donkeys also have an irritating habit of stopping in the middle of the road to watch oncoming vehicles charging at them, with the result that their numbers have been steadily decreasing. I arrived in the city shortly after noon and easily found my way round with the help of a useful tourist map I acquired at the hotel in Francistown. Nowhere was particularly far from the central station, so I made my way directly to the ministry, only to discover that everyone is at lunch. I waited, and Ma Maikano arrived punctually at 2 p.m., and invited me into her office. She knew about me and was expecting to meet me, but what Mr. Chakalisa had failed to impart was that I had already started teaching. This became apparent as our conversation unfolded. We were on two entirely different scripts. She assumed that I was someone who was wishing to teach in Botswana and at some future date, the process taking up to 3 months to complete, um, as I would need both a medical and the approval of the Ministry of Immigration. Where are you staying? In Zimbabwe? How can we get hold of you? I felt a very cold sweat running down my back. But Ma, I have already started teaching. I have been moved into a very expensive house and I have paid rent uh, that I cannot afford unless I'm earning a salary. Mama Kina was not very pleased with this piece of news. Who told you you could do that? She demanded. You have not been hired by us to teach here, and you do not have the permission of the Ministry of Immigration to work in this country. You are in very serious trouble. Visions of being locked up in a van and deported out of the country began to dance in my heated brain. I was in Harare last week preparing to go home to Canada when I received a call from Mr. Chakalisa asking why I was not already at Matas Bay. I only came because he told me to. I didn't. I do not know if I can afford to wait 3 months to find out if I have a job. I know that if you say no after 3 months, then I will not be able to afford to fly back to my home. I have a wife and she is pregnant, and I have to say goodbye to. I have said goodbye to Zimbabwe already. Where shall I go? Astonishingly, she softened her stand. I see we have a problem, Ra. I will talk to Mr. Chakalisa. Come back and see me in the morning. Be here at 8:30, and I will try and sort this out. I left, shaking as I was shaking as I left, and I headed for the nearby mall. Over a cup of red rooibos tea, served on the balcony of the president's hotel, I spent anxious moments trying to recalculate what to do. Certainly, I would be able to fly home, but there would be no money for food or rent, and jobs took a time to land. How would we survive? Baby steps, I told myself, and thought about where I would spend the night, or perhaps several nights. I remembered that WUSC had offices in Habaroni and possibly a hostel. They were listed in the phone book, and the address was only a few blocks around the corner. Providence came to my rescue. The field officer was warm and welcoming and soon made arrangements for me to stay at the hostel. I shopped, bought food at the market, and settled in with my thoughts. Mama Kano proved to be my guardian angel. Within 3 weeks, I had a work permit. My salary was pegged at the same scale as the British teachers, which included airfare home to Canada at the end of a 3-year contract for myself and my family. Naturally, Mr. Chakalisa was annoyed that it took the better part of a week for me to complete all the paperwork, the visits to the doctors, and the pretenses of the Ministry of Immigration. You have a lot of teaching to catch up on, Mr. Gafford. The students are now behind. And thus began my association with Botswana, a charming, confusing, and maddeningly complicated country that was to become the birthplace of my children.